But here's the thing, here these numbers are pretty amazing. 52% reported sexual harassment and 30% reported sexual assault. Almost a third, and yet nobody seems to be doing anything to adjudicate these cases. They also found that 71% of the women were harassed, actually had depression, compared to 41% of the non-harassed women. Now let's talk about those numbers for a second. Obviously, 71% is huge, but 41% of even the non-harassed women having depression, that is also a very concerning number. They say in the US about 10 to 15% is the average of the rate of postpartum depression. Okay, now personally, I've always thought that number was higher, but 41% is substantially higher than that. Again, like I said, I would put it around on average 25%, but when you start looking at this particular population, you see the really high level of vulnerability. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science Chick Report. I'm Kathleen Kendall-Tackett, and today we're going to actually talk a little bit about something that I've noticed that I think is a particular area of vulnerability within the postpartum depression world and looking at perinatal depression. And that's the effects and the outcomes for mothers in the military. And most of the studies, all but one actually, have been done in the U.S. So this is really kind of reflecting U.S. rates, but I want to kind of just talk a little bit about kind of what these numbers look like. And I think you're going to agree with me that they're pretty shocking. And it's something, honestly, that I don't really feel is being very well addressed. We talk about treatment, but we're not really talking about prevention in some of these cases. And again, like I said, we tend to kind of, I think, minimize. This is a population that I think is particularly vulnerable. Okay, so just to kind of give a little bit of a framework, since 2000, the number of women in the U.S. military has basically tripled. And it might even be at higher rates now. That's based on 2000 numbers. So again, like I said, here we are 25 years out, and it's probably even much higher. So there are many, many, many thousands of women serving in the U.S. military. But we're going to look particularly at some vulnerability areas for them, particularly in the perinatal period. And I think actually, again, some of these numbers are really, to me, kind of shocking. So what we're going to actually really talk about is, not only the impact of just being in the military and its effect on perinatal health, but also birth outcomes. But we're going to talk specifically about a type of military trauma, which is military sexual trauma. Okay, so military sexual trauma, we've been seeing lots and lots and lots of studies on this. I actually edit a trauma journal, and so I've seen studies of this for many years. Really, when you look at this, we think about this in terms of rates of postpartum depression, for example. The numbers in here were just shocking. And I actually literally just stumbled on these numbers when I was working on my book, Depression in New Mothers. These papers, I actually have to admit, kind of blew my mind. I knew there was some increased vulnerability within this population, but I had no idea it was this high. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what this is. So when we talk about military sexual trauma, first of all, the rates of this are really high. I think you'll be kind of surprised by this. And it doesn't seem to be really addressed. I mean, VA centers across the U.S. have treatment centers for this, so they know it's there, but it doesn't seem like the armed services has yet taken this on. And we're talking about things like the health and wellness of our soldiers, and unit cohesion. And there's a lot of reasons why we really should. But also, too, when you're talking about a group that actually can have bad birth outcomes that are not only expensive, but can lead to some bad outcomes for the whole family. So, there's lots and lots of reasons why we should be paying attention to this. But when you talk about military sexual trauma, this can actually happen to men and women. And it really, it goes all the way, kind of as a spectrum from harassment to assault. And usually when they're talking about harassment, they're not saying something like, oh, you look nice today, which in some places that could be considered sexual harassment. But no, it's much more severe here. They're usually saying something rather inappropriate and about body parts or using some kind of filthy language. So it feels threatening, and our bodies actually treat it that way. But then it goes all the way up to rape. So it really runs the entire range. And a lot of studies have actually separated out harassment versus actual sexual assault. But you'll see that a number of people have been looking at this. And one of the things that we know is that military sexual trauma can actually have an effect above and beyond the effect of combat exposure. And so, again, that's really something incredible. We have so many people that are coming back from war zones that have been really seriously affected by what they saw and observed and participated in. And to say that there's something that's going on during deployment or even back at base that is actually causing more severe effects than that, I think is really saying something. And so this was actually a review article that was looked at 43 different studies, and they compared symptoms related to combat exposure versus military sexual trauma. I found again that it had an independent effect, but that both uniquely contributed to PTSD symptoms, but military sexual trauma was more strongly related to depression and suicidality versus combat exposure was more strongly related to alcohol use. Okay, so we also see that, there's some effects on health. This was another big study that looked at women in the military, so again, not distinguishing perinatal, but actually found a lot of chronic pain syndromes were related to military sexual trauma and increased the risk of hypertension in this one sample of male and female veterans. So this was over 788,000. For women, it resulted in a 20% greater risk, which was higher than it was for men for, all of those conditions like hypertension. But that was even after controlling for a lot of the other risk factors like demographic factors, lifestyle, cardiovascular risk, and psychiatric disorders. So that was from Chikowski in Military Medicine in 2017. So that's just to give you kind of a little bit of a backdrop. So now let's focus in and look specifically at perinatal women. And again, like I said, I literally stumbled on this literature, but to me, it was pretty shocking. Okay, so let's take a look at the first study here. And this is actually from Manzo in 2024. And this is from the Journal of Midwifery and Women's Health. And they looked at 16 different studies on the impact of military trauma on pregnancy outcomes. So it was a lit review. And they found 14 of the 16 found that military women were at higher risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes, including preterm birth, low birth weight, gestational diabetes, and hypertensive disorders, like eclampsia, so pretty serious stuff, in addition to perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Okay, so again, finding that there's all of these huge risk just for being in the military, kind of independent of if there's military sexual trauma. And so again, finding that there's something about the culture in that is actually leading to a lot more symptomatology compared to age-matched civilian populations. Okay, so the next study I want to talk about that specifically looks at military sexual trauma is actually from Gross, and it's in the Journal of Women's Health. And this was actually a study of 620 U.S. female veterans during pregnancy and 452 postpartum. Okay, so some of them were lost to follow up, I'd assume. But here's the thing. These numbers are pretty amazing. 52% reported sexual harassment and 30% reported sexual assault. Almost a third, and yet nobody seems to be doing anything to adjudicate these cases. They also found that 71% of the women were harassed, actually had depression, compared to 41% of the non-harassed women. Now let's talk about those numbers for a second. Obviously, 71% is huge, but 41% of even the non-harassed women having depression, that is also a very concerning number. They say in the U.S. about 10 to 15% is the average of the rate of postpartum depression. Okay, now personally, I've always thought that number was higher, but 41% is substantially higher than that. Again, like I said, I would put it around on average 25%, but when you start looking at this particular population, you see the really high level of vulnerability, even for women who have not experienced. So it does say something about the culture for women. There is something going on that's actually kind of increasing this vulnerability. But 71% for the women who were harassed. In addition, the harassed women, 56% had PTSD. So this is telling you this is beyond just making comments or saying somebody looks nice or not commenting on appearance. This is way beyond that, because you're not going to get post-traumatic stress disorder from those kinds of things. So it must trigger some kind of sense of threat, is what I'm saying. 56% also had an anxiety disorder. Those are the harassed women. Now, compared to 24% of the non-harassed women. So again, that anxiety level, even for the non-harassed, is still high. But having half this group have it, I mean, that's really, really high. Okay, so the U.S. civilian population for the PTSD rate for the civilian population for women is 10% in the US. So again, this gives you an idea of how high these numbers are. So it's not surprising that women in the military would have higher levels, but it's quite a bit higher. This is then, they looked at then among these women, the women who were sexually assaulted. They said 77% were depressed. Okay, so that's almost all of them. That's a huge percentage. That's more than 3/4. But it was versus 48% of the non-assaulted women. So again, wow, big difference, both those rates. But, that's just an astonishing rate for the sexually assaulted women. And the thing is, I don't think we're ever even asking about this when we talk about perinatal mood disorders. We're not asking about, if they've been in the military. 65% had PTSD if they experienced sexual assault versus 30% for the non-assaulted, so still really high. And 60% of the assaulted women had anxiety versus 40% for the non-assaulted. All the women across the board had very high levels of all of these things. Okay, and these are concerning because if you have these during pregnancy, you're much more likely to have adverse birth outcomes. We see that in lots of literature in the civilian outcomes. And I could actually even explain the physiology to you. You have that chronic activation of the stress system. It sends out inflammatory messengers that ripen the cervix. I mean, you can actually explain why exactly this is, but these numbers are very high. They're really quite unacceptable, and we're really honestly not talking about this. Okay, so here is another study. 1,005 veterans who've recently given birth, and the author of that study is Schaefer, and this was published in Women's Health Issues in 2024. Okay, so they found that in this group, very similar to the previous study, 32% reported rape and 51% reported harassment. Of these, 40% had PTSD, compared again to the civilian population for women is 10%. And the women who reported both military sexual trauma and PTSD were more likely to describe their birth experiences negatively. Okay, so again, that's not really surprising, but what is a little surprising is it's just a small percentage, 15%, that actually did describe their births that way. So the people with, depression and stuff, or military sexual trauma and PTSD, that tends to kind of color your perception, so you are kind of more likely, but that was actually kind of reassuring. And the sample was split fairly evenly in terms of white versus women of color. Okay, so the next study is actually 911 women who reported on a total of 1,752 unique pregnancies. And the author of that is Nilni, and that was published in actually Psychological Trauma in 2022. This was actually, again, I'm the editor of that journal, and I saw it go by. And so then when I was getting ready to write the book, I started flagging more articles. What they found is that 59% reported military sexual trauma, so it's not quite as high, and that 36% reported combat exposure, and 55% reported at least one violent childhood trauma. Okay, so out of that, during at least one pregnancy since entering the military, 29% reported a preterm birth. Okay, so the U.S. national average is 11%. 9% had a baby with low birth weight, and 45% had postpartum depression. So these rates of depression are a little bit lower, but they're still really, really high. And also this rate of preterm birth, it's almost triple the national average. That's actually very concerning because for a long time, preterm birth was listed by organizations such as the World Health Organization as the number one risk factor for infant mortality. And, it's kind of dropped in some things to number two, but it's still a very, very concerning symptom. So, this is a really serious outcome. They also said that military sexual trauma increased the risk of lower infant birth weight and postpartum depression, but only slightly increased the risk for preterm birth. But they actually were able to kind of measure it. They said for every 1 unit increase on the sexual harassment scale, birth weight decreased by 17 grams. Okay, so again, the more types of things people reported that they experienced, the bigger the decrease in the birth weight. They said the odds of full-term birth decreased by 3%, and depression and anxiety increased by 9%. So they were able to kind of actually map it out. Okay, so then the final study I want to talk about is another one. It's got 697 US veterans, and they specifically looked at mother infant bonding. The author of that study is Creech et al., and this was also in 2022 in the journal Depression and Anxiety. Now, again, that's not actually really surprising that if somebody is experiencing harassment, it's probably going to make them depressed. And if they're depressed, it's harder to kind of do those interactions that we need to do to bond with our babies. So, I mean, you can actually kind of trace it back. And so, of course, one of the important things is you want to treat the depression. That's really important. But the other thing is we want to make sure incidents get tracked. Okay, so they said it was military sexual trauma, and they said, again, very similar numbers. They said 52% reported harassment and 30% reported abuse or rape. Okay, and that 28% of the women who experienced military sexual trauma were depressed. Okay, so that's actually a lower number, but it's still really high when you compare it to what's considered the normal rate of that in a population, which is 10 to 15%. It's about where I would put it in terms of if I looked at everybody, I tend to say more like 25%. You could still say similar and extremely high rates of this. So I think the kind of the main thing I wanted to just say about this is, I think this is an issue we really haven't looked at very seriously. And I think actually it's something that we probably should be talking about. And when we're talking about postpartum depression, I think we need to be including this, because I think sometimes people think, oh, yeah, women in the military, they're just like, other moms. Yes, in many ways they are. But obviously there is something in that culture, that even if you are not harassed or sexually assaulted, perhaps you know of other people who have been, but there's something that is actually leading to all these negative birth outcomes, and this is something that really can, impact combat readiness. It can impact, fitness, uh, unit cohesion, you name it. And oftentimes, there could be situations where, somebody is assaulted. This could be a man or a woman, and then they still have to work with these people. And during a deployment, which is kind of a high risk time for these things to happen, this is actually really compounded because, you actually are depending on your team, for survival, basically. And if somebody kind of steps out and assaults you, it's very hard. And I think a lot of times women, we talk about this in terms of this construct called betrayal trauma, which is basically this idea that, if somebody betrays you, it really actually compounds the effect of the traumatic event. Either they betrayed you because of they were in a position of trust and they abused you, which could be in this situation, or they didn't respond appropriately when abuse was reported, and so it could really kind of be both. So that's just something I wanted to raise as an issue for us to be thinking about, talking about. I think when we are writing guidelines on postpartum depression, they kind of need to be separate. There really are very good programs in the military to work with new mothers, but I'd like to see them incorporate a little bit more of this because I don't think this has really been touched on. So that's going to be kind of what I wanted to say today. I want to just wrap it up and say thanks for listening. If you have any comments, feel free. In the meantime, you might want to check out the article that I wrote about this. And I go into a little more detail about, the other types of abuse that these women often come into contact with. But it's actually in the Medical Research Archives, which is actually, and this paper just came out last year. So take a look. It's called Mothers in the Military, and it's looking at the impact of, violence on birth outcomes. And so that's actually, again, if you want to kind of even get a broader picture. But I wanted to really kind of focus in specifically on the military sexual trauma, because I think that's something we really haven't talked about very much. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.